Hi everyone. I'm here today with Arian Wallach, who's an ecologist with a focus on compassionate conservation at the Centre of Compassionate Conservation at University of Technology, Sydney. Welcome, Arian. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm so pleased to have you here.
Thanks, Sandra.
We have met many years ago at the Compassionate Conservation at a conference, and that was a really lovely time for me. And so I'm really pleased to see you again, even if it's not in person. Please, Arian, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, who you are, and why you do what you do.
My background is as an ecologist. I'm originally from Israel. I came to do my PhD in Australia and got stranded. I fell in love with dingoes. I did my PhD on dingoes. And my work with dingoes was pretty much straightforward ecology work, perhaps conservation biology work, trying to understand how dingoes influence ecosystems in such a way that that certain problems such as loss of vegetation in certain areas or loss of species diversity and richness, particularly of small mammals that are potentially vulnerable to predation by cats and foxes, and how protecting dingoes, or just not killing dingoes, could have this, what is called a trophic cascades, a cascading effect on other wildlife. And so that was where I started out in Australia. And through that work, I came to ask some basic fundamental questions about why I even became an ecologist in the first place. Certainly, what does it even mean to be a conservation biologist? What is conservation at all? What is it that we're trying to do? And what spurred me to ask these questions was encountering what I call the dark side of conservation. I'd never heard of conservation being applied or achieved through bullet and bait. I'd never encountered that before. I'd never heard that that killing huge amounts of wildlife or harming them another way, poisoning them, shooting them, that was just a normal way to achieve conservation goals. And so encountering it created a real internal dissonance to the point that I didn't even understand what I was doing in this field at all. I just assumed that conservationists were like the elves of Lord of the Rings. They're the good guys, right, that are battling to save the green planet. And then there are the evil corporate consumption machinery that are the orcs. Pretty simple. And then suddenly my fellow elves are gunning animals from helicopters and putting out poisons, one of which killed my dog. These were things that were very difficult to understand. And so when I finished my PhD, I realized that I actually need to learn how to think about why we do what we do, why I do what I do, what is it that matters, what is it that matters more than something else. And that brought me to ethics and to understanding that conservation is an intermingling of science and ethics, and that you cannot really do conservation, certainly not well. You can't do it without good science, but you also can't do it without good ethics. And that's what brought me to compassionate conservation.
This is incredible because I had no idea that conservation is done differently anywhere else in the world. And I've certainly had similar feelings in the same way as you do about conservation, but also in the agricultural sector of how agriculture is done in Australia, and I'm sure all over the world. But then again, I'm not sure. And so you're saying that Australia is in particularly violent in the conservation efforts as opposed to other countries. Is that what I'm understanding?
I don't know how Australia would compare. It probably would be one of the more, I guess we can say yes, one of the more violent forms of conservation would be applied here. It's certainly not unusual, though. New Zealand is pretty strongly reliant on lethal methods to achieve its aims. Many countries in Southern Africa, South Africa, for example, that uses, for example, trophy hunting and other forms of commodification of wildlife for conservation goals, the United States as well. It varies. In Israel, what I encountered as a conservation biologist was, again, coming from a country that is very small and very highly populated. The concern was always about urbanization. You know, how many roads are crisscrossing the landscape, and you know, how much space is there for wildlife to move around. So it was a pretty clear divide between concrete and green. And I was on the side, I was a greenie, and I was standing in opposition to the concrete. And here, there's endless open spaces, which is why I wanted to move here. I was feeling pretty like I didn't have much space to roam in Israel. And I thought Australia would be the place where things can really, really be wild. And I found the very opposite. I found that here, the wild is intensely controlled, whereas in Israel, with all of its problems and being in a state of war and with such a high human population, it was in some respects wilder. And so that was something that I've been thinking through. So yes, it is cultural. So conservation is a cultural thing. The way it's done in Australia is very different to, let's say, India is very different again. Israel is different. South Africa is different. Canada is different. Thailand is different. It depends on our culture.
That's very interesting, and it makes sense. So from a perspective of nature and perspective of as in the wild, as in I'm seeing that there's a discrepancy between how we view nature and its timing on how it does things and its interactions, as opposed to humans and how we value that and what we want to control in it. So how does science fit into this cultural perspective of conservation?
Science, that's a really good question. So science has become this kind of overarching, almost like a screen. There's this sense that conservation is simply about science, that if you just knew, if we knew what we need to know, and we applied what it is that we know accurately, then we could solve any problem and deal with things very effectively. There's a general misunderstanding about what science can and can't do. And firstly, science can't tell us that there's such a thing as a problem. Science is not a methodology through which we can even think about what is the good in the world. Conservation is an ethically driven field. Part of it can simply be about our own survival. We want to know, how do we ensure that the planet continues to operate in such a way that we can continue to live on it? But conservation generally is about more than that. It's about the flourishing of all forms of life and all of their diversities. And yet that in itself becomes a very complicated thing because certain beings, certain creatures matter to us more than others. For example, we care generally more about elephants than we do about coronavirus. We judge things differently. What is it that we care about, and why do we care about that? Why do we value things in particular ways? All of those values is then it's like the engine that then drives what kind of scientific questions we ask, what kind of methods we use, and how we judge when there are conflicts between, for example, maybe we have a predator that we think we really want to protect, and there's another animal that predator hunts that we also want to protect, and the one is hunting the other, And then what do we do? How do we protect both if one is when there are these kinds of conflicts? How do we think about them? We talk about things like biodiversity. Biodiversity can mean anything and everything. It's not exactly a scientific term. It can be used in a scientific context, but biodiversity of what? Of the bacteria in our guts, of on our skin, of plants, of which plants, of animals, of which animals, and when? Of today, 1 million years ago, of the future. And the way that we go about thinking through these things extends beyond the realm of pure science. Science is a method of inquiry, of trying to understand how things are. But conservation is about our relationship with the more than human world. And that's an ethical relationship, or an unethical one.
Yes, so basically you're saying that what we value is what we're going to try to protect. So if we value wallabies over dingoes, or sheep over dingoes, or then that drives what happens, but then also that has an effect on actual biodiversity, as in the number of varied species within an ecosystem. So how, yes, like in Australia, for me, it feels like there's a need for compassionate conservation because I don't know, I feel like it's almost like a racist approach to conservation, where the things that are alien or have come from somewhere else, we don't value as much. And the things that have been here for, more than 5,000 years ago, because the dingo apparently came 5,000 years ago, and we don't seem to value it as much. So what is Australian ethical perspective then on conservation from your current, how you see it through your research and also through your opinion? And what are we to do to study it in a different manner, to open our eyes to the fact that conservation is about the biodiversity of what's here right now, because that increases, for me, biodiversity means, the increase of living things to a point where themselves, they sort of find a niche, but the more we have of organisms, the better. That's how I understand biodiversity, that the more we have, the more varieties, the more species, the better it is. So how do we translate that into our current situation with the current species that we have in Australia?
So the Australian conservation movement is, and its science is based on a particular ethical orientation that can be called nativism, which is the idea that species that are understood to have been here before the arrival of Europeans, and that's a very particular date. We have a date, 1788, and anything that was here before then is what belongs here and what we should conserve. It's essentially what makes Australia Australia, right? Wallabies belong in Australia, not in Hawaii, not in Paris, not in New Zealand, but there are wallabies in all those places too, right? Rabbits belong in some people's minds in the UK, but rabbits are actually considered native in the Iberian Peninsula. For example, Spain. Rabbits do not belong in Australia. And the reason why some argue that they do not belong in Australia is not only that they're not from here, that they're kind of messing up this picture of what Australia should be, but also that they're exerting pressures on those that we do support. They go around and they eat things, and they're eaten by other things that then go along and eat other things. Every living being exerts pressure. There's no such thing as being alive and not causing some kind of harm to someone else. That's the curse of all of us. But at the same time, you also can't be alive without benefiting someone. We have these kinds of relationships, all of us, whether you're a rabbit or a mosquito or a human being, where you're going to benefit someone and harm someone else, and that will even change depending on the day. But from a nativist perspective, what we want to do is, or what nativists want to do, is conserve what is here. If there are a few added species here and there, then they're not valued, but as long as they're not clearly harming those that are particularly endemic and can be found nowhere else in the world, then that's okay. They're not valued in any particular way, but sometimes they'll be considered as a potential threat. So for example, maybe there's some species of tree that, let's say Lantana, is not known to cause extinction of anyone or any species, but maybe it could over enough time because they haven't co-evolved for a very, very long period of time with all of the species around here. So what I'm describing is a certain worldview that is both ethical and empirical, and a certain understanding of evolution, and a certain understanding of ecology, and a certain understanding of what is the good of the world. I don't subscribe to that view, maybe because I come from a landscape that is kind of the linking point between Asia and Africa, and where not far from my home, there were like an archaeological sites with both ancient human remains, and also of two different human species in this one cave, not far. One is a Neanderthal and one a Homo sapiens, just where I lived. There used to be hippopotamuses not far from where I live too, and now they're gone, and there's been a huge dynamism. There are birds that migrate through that part of the world, and so I'm probably more used to this idea of ecology being dynamic and ever-changing. Australia often thinks of itself as an island that has been isolated, and then there's a kind of clear idea of what belongs in it and what doesn't. If you take what I would call like an inclusive ethical orientation that simply says every creature belongs wherever they can thrive, wherever they do thrive is where they belong. Belongingness is simply a description of reality. And what happens when you take an inclusive worldview, it actually changes your understanding of what's going on in the world. For example, you suddenly see new species. You see new population dynamics. For example, the rabbit that is so despised here is actually an endangered species in the Iberian Peninsula. And yet, if we were to include the roughly 900 population that are now spread out across the world on various interesting little islands here and there, and most of them are in Australia, then suddenly you see, rather than the endangerment of the rabbit, the flourishing of the rabbit. Or you discover, for example, that camels that have been extinct where I originally come from, where I'm native, camels, the dromedary camel as a wild animal went extinct about 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. Australia now has a population of getting close to 500,000. So that's a situation where an animal has gone from being extinct, apart from those that are being held captive, and those captive ones I still see in Israel. But there are no wild camels in Arabia anymore. Across the Levant, across North Africa, they're gone, probably due to human hunting. And yet here they are, a huge population in Australia. And yet that's never celebrated. They're not even listed in any formal conservation data set. They don't exist because they're considered feral animals. Now that represents not something about the world, but represents something in our minds. And what happens when you let go of those kinds of strict categories, you belong, you don't, you should be here, you don't, then suddenly you open your eyes and you see, oh my goodness, we live in an incredibly wild world right now. In some respects, wilder than it has been for thousands of years, again, depending how you think about it. In some respects, deeply harmed, and in some respects, incredibly flourishing. but it certainly opens the scope of what it is that we're seeing that's going on in the world. And for me, that's a great source of joy and optimism for the future of the living beings of this planet, and for us too.
So with the camel specifically, because I know that we're shooting a lot of them, I don't even know what happens to them once they're shot. We don't hear much about it. It's just something that happens. Are they actually having an impact that's not kind to the Australian other, to other species? And if so, like, can the impact be, do we measure that impact? And is this just solely because they introduced that they're getting, evacuated from the environment?
Well, you can say yes and yes. I mean, are they harming species defined as native? Yes, because they're alive. Of course you're harming someone. Are they benefiting someone? Of course they are. I mean, Australia used to be full of megafauna. Australia had these giant wombats and had a whole range of very odd looking, in my mind, huge animals that went extinct about mostly 20 to 40,000 years ago, most likely due to human hunting. And now we have a megafauna like camels, also wild donkeys, some deer, wild horses, wild cattle, all sorts, that are moving across the landscape and are bringing back many of the functions that were lost in this geological epoch called the Pleistocene. We're now in the Holocene, and during the Pleistocene, one of the tragedies, right? Geology, our history of the Earth is full of tragedies, and one of the tragedies was the collapse of the megafauna all around the world. Pretty much wherever humans went, big animals, that's what megafauna means, so big beasts, disappeared, primarily because humans hunted them. They hunted them out from North America. Many of the people that listening will be surprised to know that camels actually originate in North America. They reach their highest diversity. They're known to have started to evolve there about 4 million years ago, and every single species in the camelid family went extinct in North America only about 8,000 years ago because humans arrived. And so are they harming? Yes, certainly. There'd be eating plants that hadn't been eaten before. Are they benefiting? Yes, they're moving nutrients in ways that haven't been moved, and churning up the soil and helping seeds move and providing food for other creatures and changing the ecology, benefiting some, of course. I see this as a form of flourishing. You can also see this as a form of harm. The problem is when you see this as a form of harm, then you're blinding yourself both to the incredible capacity of life's resilience. And it also tends to bring us to these very, like you were describing, these extremely violent ways of interacting with the world. In the case of camels, flying around in a helicopter and shooting them from the sky and leaving their bodies to rot. I mean, these are sentient beings. These are living beings who have personalities, who have family members, who have friends, who have emotional capacity, who have the capacity to suffer, who have psychological states, who can experience trauma, pain, just like you and I and anyone else. And if the best conservation can do is fly around in a helicopter and shoot these magnificent beings, magnificent as individuals, magnificent as a story of rewilding, I don't know if conservation is worth it then. I mean, if that is the best conservation has to offer, I don't think that we need conservation anymore.
Yes, and this is where I question everything as well, and I just see the beauty of every animal, and and its value just in being, the pleasure from even just my own selfish pleasure of looking at it or interacting with it. And with this view of compassionate conservation and seeing things as individuals, seeing animals as individuals that have feelings and are sentient, is this where the basis of compassionate conservation is in? This fact that these are living beings that are magnificent and they have value and they have goodness in them just by living. Is this where it really, is that the root of it? It's an ethical question, isn't it really? And I'll let you answer that first before I ask more.
Probably the biggest difference in the worldview that drives compassionate conservation and the worldview that drives much of traditional conservation is whether or not you consider an individual, whether you consider individual to have intrinsic value, whether you see our goals, what we should be doing as conservationists is caring about the well-being and flourishing not only of species and ecosystems, but also in how we relate to everyone around us, is whether we see the world as populated by persons, camel persons, elephant persons, bilby persons, bettong persons, wallaby persons, that we relate to with compassion, with respect, with dignity, that we treat them as we would hope to be treated ourselves if we were in their place. That yes, we want the wallaby as an entity, as something called, the genus Macropus. We want Macropus to exist in the world. We're pro-Macropus and we're pro-Camelus. But we're also paying attention to what it means to have a relationship when we're standing in front of a camel as a friend, or standing in front of a camel as a manager. You have a very different kind of relationship with the world. Traditional conservation, and there are various forms too within conservation, but certainly I would say much of conservation certainly agrees that living beings have intrinsic value, that we should care about them for their own sake, regardless of what they do for us. Not all conservationists see it that way. Some conservationists have taken the view that we should protect things based on what they can do for us, like that frog, the picture of the frog behind you. Should we protect that frog because they provide ecosystem services that enable our survival, or because the frog just has intrinsic value as a frog? Most conservationists would agree that frog, I can't remember the genus name, maybe you can, or the species name, should be protected, and that we want to see the world, that frog as part of the world for as long as possible. Even though species, like individuals, do die. Most species that have ever existed on this planet have gone extinct. All species are born, so to speak, and die. They go extinct. And we want certainly ourselves as human beings, we want to live in such a way that would enable that frog to continue to exist. And that's where traditional conservationists and compassionate conservationists usually agree, that frog has value. But what is it that we're willing to do to protect that frog, or what is it that we consider of value in that frog, begins to change when, for example, there's maybe a member of species that's eating that frog that we want to protect. And do we take that frog and put them in miserable conditions and for some captive breeding program? So, right, conservationists will often do that. You'll go to the zoo, and a zoo will have some captive breeding program to release, maybe or not, some of them into the wild. From a compassionate conservation perspective, you may ask, well, if you were that frog, would you want to be part of that captive breeding program for the sake of your species? And if not, if you would not agree to participate, if you were in their shoes, you would be very hesitant then to take control of this frog's life and deprive them of what it means to have a good life, a flourishing life from that frog's perspective.
Yeah, I feel like that's exactly what I feel like. We never ask the question as to, from the other person's perspective, whether it's an animal, a human being, or, you know, it's very rare that there's a question, but what would you like? And even though we don't speak the language, we might imagine what it would be like to be that animal and be shot from a helicopter, or, you know, be stuck in a zoo, whatever it is. And I feel, yes, this is a big quandary. I think that separation between ourselves as individuals from, and even as a species, from other species, you know, having that connection, this is where I think is that missing connecting link, where in other cultures throughout thousands of years, people might have had that connection, and maybe some still do, that is deeper than currently we have, you know, in our society. But I also wonder, like, sort of just, you know, looking through journals, scientific journals, and just understanding a little bit of, you know, biodiversity research or conservation research, it seems to me that every question we ask is not even about, it's the way research is driven seems even not to ask the right questions. We're only looking at the side effects that we visibly see right now in this moment. We're not considering the fact that there are pioneer species, that there are waves of, you know, how species adjust when they're introduced to the rest. And like the cane toad is a great example. You know, one of my friends is a expert on frogs, and he says, no, they've in Southeast Queensland, cane toads should be left alone. They're now food for other animals. They need to be part of the ecosystem now. Removing them now will destroy all these adapted species, you know. And I think this is where I'd like to see more research done in the goodness of these organisms. What benefits are there? Lantana, how many butterflies does it attract? I know it might not be feeding caterpillars, but the amount of butterflies recently I've seen myself and counted the species numbers on Lantana. It makes me love it. And I know it's not a popular belief, but maybe we need to start valuing everything and studying its value rather than its tragic current, you know, in a very impoverished ecosystem. We're just looking at the bad, but are we seeing that maybe they're regenerating the soil? Maybe they, you know, feeding something that other species that's feeding on it can no longer get anywhere else because we've murdered the environment. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've actually we've had something of a cane toad tragedy around here where I live. Cane toads, in my view, are relatively ugly amphibians, but they have the most beautiful voice I've ever heard. At nighttime, their songs are just the most beautiful, beautiful songs. And I loved hearing them in the dam right in front of the house, singing through the night. And the songs have been getting gradually quieter and quieter as this water rat, or maybe several actually, water rats, which are a native Australian rodent, beautiful, one of my favorite species of all time. It's almost like a kind of, it's like a rodent variation on an otter. They're quite large. They have a long black tail with a white stripe on it. And these water rats have been massacring the cane toads in the dam. And it reached a point that whenever I would hear the song of the cane toad, I would just know to expect to find the mangled body of that poor cane toad by morning, until there were virtually none left. They're still here, they're still in other pools, and they're still certainly part of our ecosystem. But I've experienced the loss of these beautiful cane toads because of these beautiful water rats, and that's part of ecology. You have life and death, and you have the rise and fall of populations. Cane toads used to be very plentiful here, and now they're quite hard to find. There are many, many species that feed on cane toads, like your friend told you. There's no evidence that cane toads have caused a single extinction, as far as I'm aware. The various predators are adapting to them very quickly. I've already seen evidence of cane toad hunting or cane toad massacring by birds in particular in the Kimberley, which is an area they've only reached recently in the northwest of only living being on the planet that knows how to think and figure things out. Just, right, we learn and we adapt, and that's what animals have been doing. They've either physically evolved in relation to the cane toad. For example, red-bellied black snakes were very vulnerable to cane toads. I live in an area that has so many red-bellied blacks and so many cane toads. So that because the red-bellied blacks have now physically adapted to cane toads, whereas other animals are actually learning tricks, like the water rats just eating the legs, or birds that are flipping them over. The same with lantana. I think one of the most beautiful plants. We have a lot of lantana in the area where we live. That's beautiful. Lantana has spread all around the world, killing lantana. Whether you like lantana or not, lantana is an extremely successful plant. There is no point in trying. Just don't waste your time. If you have anything to do with day, if you can choose between killing lantana and doing anything else, like do the dishes, clean your car, play the guitar, do anything that would be more useful, even if you want a world with less lantana for whatever reason, don't waste your time. And there's so many creatures that benefit from lantana. In India, by the way, sloth bears eat lantana berries. Lots of species do. So yes, long live lantana.
Yep, I agree. And it's not a popular belief. You get hammered when you post things about lantana being good, but that's okay. And, and I always think if we were gone tomorrow, if COVID killed us all off, or someone pressed a button and a nuclear warfare started and we all died, the only thing I can imagine is all these amazing weeds taking over and rewilding, but also regenerating the earth. Plant matter, it's all going to fix carbon. It's going to suck that carbon out of the atmosphere. Whatever's doing it, let it do it, I say, because, and I also feel like from a soil perspective, lantana grows is damage. And lantana can survive that damage and create habitat still, and create food, and create beautiful soil underneath with silica in it. And so, we don't understand what these gifts are of each of these species. And I feel like if only we studied the gifts, if only we looked at all of these creatures and all these plants and said, hey, let's have a look what it's doing. How good is that? Or what microbes are living on its roots? What's going on? Why is it such a successful creature? I would love to see that in future compassionate conservation, or not even conservation, just research. In terms of compassionate conservation, what are some of the amazing, I've read a few articles now about just the options that are there. Like, what are the examples that you might use to show people that if we take the compassionate conservation approach, in this case, these are the benefits now that are gained, rather than just killing the species or doing something violent to these species. What are some of the examples you can give us?
I would just start by saying that firstly, what happens when you take a compassionate conservation perspective, what you consider to be a benefit also changes, right? What it is that you're kind of aiming to do. So a benefit would also be improving our relationships with one another, being aware that the world is full of persons and not just not just these kind of mechanical entities, right? That improving our relationship, being able to see the lantana with wonder and to look into the eye of a wild camel, that is a benefit. But there are certainly areas where we all share similar desires, such as we would like to see all of the species, all of the, for example, small animals, many of whom have been becoming endangered and several have gone extinct. We would like to see those that are endangered flourishing again. We would like to see bilbies coming back and bettongs coming back, and many species that are endangered, we'd like to see them flourishing. at this point in time, the traditional approach to doing that, to enabling or to promoting their recovery, is by killing their predators or eradicating their predators. For example, Australia declared a war on wild cats, or they call them feral cats. And they vowed to kill, I think it was 2 million by this year, 2 million by 2020, eradicating them from several offshore islands, building these fenced enclosures and killing all non-native predators inside them, cats and foxes. And then introducing these endangered small animals into them, and then hoping either by releasing them on islands or allowing them to hopefully build up their numbers in areas where we continue to kill their predators as intensely as possible. The success rate of that approach has been very low. Yes, you can put a small animal on an island and they will do very well, but they will, of course, also be vulnerable to rats or mice or cats arriving on that island in the future. So essentially, you've created a vulnerable population forever. And the world is not made up of little islands, and the world isn't made up of little fenced reserves, and we can't shoot everyone, and we can't poison everyone, and hopefully, nor do we want to. We have essentially Australia, we should think of more as a continent rather than as an island. And what happens very often is when we go around and shoot and poison predators like foxes and cats, what happens is that the numbers of cats and foxes doesn't go down, they actually go up. And that is because their reproductive rates goes up, the territorial animals are taken out, the territories break down, you have immigration into areas where there's been a loss. And very importantly, when we're killing cats and foxes, we're also killing dingoes. And one of the first things that people did when Europeans arrived in Australia was to persecute Australia's top predator, the dingo. And dingoes are like other wolves, can be pretty nasty to foxes and cats. They are essentially predators of foxes and cats. And foxes and cats, when they live in an environment where dingoes are left in peace, they don't go extinct, but they just exist in lower densities. They are active in different times of the day. Very often those will be the times of the day where their prey can be active. So the hunting pressure on these endangered animals goes down when dingo populations recover. And dingo populations isn't just about their numbers. There are dingoes all across Australia. There's dingoes all through the Sydney Basin, all the way from the south to the north, from the east to the west. There are dingoes everywhere. But what is lacking are dingoes that can actually function as dingoes, that are not living in this kind of war zone where they're constantly poisoned. They're either poisoned by farmers who want to protect their sheep and cattle, or they're poisoned by conservationists in national parks because they want to protect small animals. It's essentially that conservation in Australia is no different to farming. You have your sheep and cattle if you're a farmer, and you have your endangered animal if you're your conservationist, and you kill the predators to protect them. It doesn't work for either. Killing dingoes makes it worse for farmers, and it makes it worse for conservationists. And so by being good allies, good friends to dingoes, by living peacefully with dingoes, dingoes then form their own relationships with cats and foxes. They don't go around and mass murder them when they're socially stable. They form understandings. They are a predator. They are a threat to them. Cats and foxes are intelligent animals. They respond to them. Cats will stay in areas where they can get away from dingoes and will be active at times of the day when they can get away from dingoes. The same with foxes. And that reduces the hunting pressure on small animals. The same goes with protecting vegetation. If we clear vegetation, if we cut down the forest, small animals have nowhere to hide from predators. So we can work with all of the beings that live amongst us, form relationships of friendship and care with them, and let each one of us do the things that we're good at. Dingoes are good at controlling cats and foxes. We don't need to worry about cats. We don't need to kill 2 million cats ever. We don't have to worry about them. Let the dingoes do what dingoes do. Trust the small animals of Australia. They're not dumb. They know what to do with cats. They just need a chance. They need vegetation where they can hide, and they need a big bad wolf in the system, and they will be fine.
The poisons that are used against dingoes, I can't imagine that they can be good for anyone that then eats the meat of the dingo, which I'm assuming everything cleans up everything. Those poisons are going to end up, you know, for potentially years affecting the rest of the environment, even humans, as in, you know, washing off into water systems. And I'm just wondering, like, you know, that's not even, to me, it's not even ethical to the rest of the environment to put a poison out. So is that intelligent to do? I doubt it. Like, these poisons are pretty.
The reason why 1080 is used in Australia, it is banned in most countries, the poison, but 1080 is a naturally occurring chemical that exists in some Australian plants, and many Australian species, herbivores, have a certain level of tolerance to it. What that means is that different species will have different levels of tolerance to 1080. So one animal can eat a certain amount and they'll be fine, and someone else, it can even actually be the same species but in a different area where they haven't grown up where that chemical is at high densities, and then they'll be susceptible. So 1080 is used in Australia also to kill, for example, macropods, wallabies. But generally, certainly wallabies will have higher tolerance to it than dingoes will. So the level of poison that you'll have in a dingo or a fox or a cat will usually be too low to cause secondary poisoning to many native species. But that's not to say that they don't. So quolls are very susceptible to 1080 poison. And of course, if you eat enough of it and you go around, so this is what happens, you put out a lot of poison, and there's no rule that says that an animal is going to only eat one of the baits. They might eat several. And so yes, native animals are going to be killed by the poison as well. The other thing is about it breaking down. If you're in a wet environment, it should break down relatively quickly. In the desert, it could stay in the environment for months. I don't think it can last for years, but if it stays, like if it falls on a bush, for example, when it's thrown out and is not touching the ground and it's dry, then it can stay active, certainly probably for even a year. But yes, there is secondary poisoning. It's not the same kind of flow on with certain poisons that are more resistant, more resilient, like strychnine, for example. You know, so again, it's also important to say that just because something is so-called natural, just because 1080 is naturally occurring, that doesn't mean that it is an appropriate way to engage with living beings, because of course the reason why it's in the plants, it's there as a defense mechanism. It's there alongside bad tasting, bad smelling compounds that are essentially telling the animal, do not eat me. When you isolate it and put it in a tasty bit of meat for a carnivore, then you're doing the very opposite. You're essentially tricking them. You're essentially giving them what seems to be a gift and tricking them by putting poison in it that they can't detect. And certainly I think that that's an extremely sick relationship to have with the world. I understand that many conservationists do that from a deep sense of loss and care for the world. But I would still say, would you do that to anyone that you cared about? Would you do that to a human being? Would you do that to your dog? Mark Beckhoff, an animal behaviorist, would ask that question: would you do that to your dog? And as someone who has had my dog killed by a 1080 poison and had her screaming and twitching in my arms, I can tell you that there is no reason in the world that I would subject anyone to that kind of death. And so it is completely unacceptable and unethical. Having the word conservation, right? It becomes a jihad. It becomes fundamentalist when we forget that there are other things that matter in the world. Yes, it is important to protect the frog species and wallaby species and elephant species, but not at any cost. We still have to maintain our humanity.
Yeah, yep, I agree. And to subject anyone to pain, it's just like being desensitized. I think as children, we all know that pain to other creatures, we're all born with that, unless we've been, damaged severely. If people just connect to their hearts when they were kids and would know that they would not want to kill an animal for any reason, harm it. And when they do experiment, they feel it, I certainly remember all of that stuff from my childhood. And we just lose that as adults, and we just become these, we want to control the environment so much. I still feel that nature is so intelligent, and it will deal with everything in its own time, and it will bring back, it's always in a state of wanting to recover. That's what I see in nature. And I think we just become so, we want to be smarter than it, and I don't believe we are, because we don't understand it. And I think I'd love to see more, not only discussions, but also science showing that, the book, But Fred Pierce is one of my favorite books. Actually, I got it at that cat workshop we did, and he sat next to me, and it's called The New Wild. And it's one of my favorite books ever, because he shows and goes really deeply into researching and talking to the researchers, and even how the numbers were fraudulent in many of the studies, or what was being told to the public. And I would love for the public to learn more about this, especially this issue of this field of compassionate conservation. How can people, that are interested in this conversation we're having, how can they reach out or learn more? Like, what would you suggest people do now, like from your perspective and your knowledge that you have gained and the research you have gained? How do you work with people? I know you work with farmers in better, sort of introducing farmers to better practices. What about the rest of the public? What can we do to, improve this understanding?
I think that's a good question. We're currently under lockdown to some extent, as with this coronavirus pandemic. And I think one thing we can do with this time is to start asking ourselves some questions, right? Suddenly the world has come to a halt. Isn't that wonderful? We have, there are terrible harms that are happening right now due to the pandemic, and there are harms to those that get sick, and there are economic harms, but there's also an opportunity here. The world has suddenly stopped, and that with that stop, we can start having conversations with one another. We can pick up the phone, right? In Australia now, we can even probably start to visit each other a little bit more, and we can start asking, what is it that we consider the good of our lives? In many respects, right? We live in a hyper-capitalist society. Is that what we want? Or do we want a society that looks after, where we look after one another a bit better? Do we want to live in a world where we are the CEOs of the universe, and we're kind of stomping around being in charge of all of the frogs, and what frog gets to live where and when, and what plant gets to sprout here and not there, and what rabbit gets to scratch his ear on this island and not on that one? Is that what we want? What kind of relationships do we want to have with rabbits and frogs and mosquitoes and with one another? This is the time to ask. And it takes, we've grown up in a certain society, we've accepted certain norms. Some of us really love birds, and many of those people don't like cats. Maybe this is an opportunity to start rethinking our relationship with cats, for example. Can Australians learn to love cats? Not just cats that we have control over their lives, cats that have control over their own lives, cats as autonomous subjects, as autonomous beings that are living in the middle of the desert and in the middle of the rainforest that we have no control over. Can we figure out how to live in a world in which we have no control over everyone? And we never will have control. I certainly hope we never will have control, some kind of horrible fascist control over every single species on the planet. What does that mean? Let's have a conversation with one another and think about it. It's a very personal journey that we all go through, but now is an opportunity to just ask why. Why do I care about this bird more than I care about that cat? Why do I care about that plant more than that plant? Or what kind of a relationship do I want to have with animals? Do I really want to go to the zoo? What am I telling my child when I'm taking a child to see an animal stuck in a cage? What kind of relationship do I want to have with my dog, with my cat, my brother, my sister? This is the time to think.
Well said. Yeah, because we live in a world of relationships. Everything is interconnected completely, and how do we manage those relationships, and how do we control them or not? And what will it feel like if we don't have control? What will it feel like when I can't go out and rip out all the lantana? It's just this feeling of hopelessness we need to, and I think we need to feel, but also I feel it's the way we've been taught. We don't realize that all these values that we've got right now towards each other and other animals and plants is not something we were born with. We were taught these values, and that means we can be retaught. I certainly have been going through a process of unlearning the scientific things that I have learned at university. For me, have been a journey now since, for many, many years of unlearning and actually discovering way deeper relationships. We're always learning, and I feel we all can learn to have this compassionate approach to life and wonder and have that childlike wonder back. And I believe with my whole heart that everyone is capable of that, and then wanting to learn from their own personal experiences with individuals, not just humans, but other species, not just repeating and having this belief that was set in them from childhood, or from university, or from mom or dad, or whatever school teacher. I think this is where you're saying, like, we need to think for ourselves, and we need to, discover the world for ourselves and with each other, with other species, with, just our relationship to the world, as you said it so perfectly. Look, thank you so much for your time. I would love to chat more in the future again, maybe. I would love to see you back. Come to me
too.
Yeah, and have you maybe back at the Woodford Folk Festival to present to our audience.
I hope so. That will be fun.
Yeah, and it's a shame we didn't get to catch up, during the planting and have you present. But I would love to hear that presentation if you ever want to share it. And thank you so much, Arian. It was just a pleasure talking to you, and I hope to speak to you again soon. And if you have any final words, please do share.
Well, I just last thing I would say is that one of the things that we could start asking ourselves is, what if we imagined ourselves to belong in this world too? That is, that we humans are also part of the wonderful biodiversity of this earth of ours. That not everything that we touch turns to dust. Not everything about us is alien to this planet or horrible, just because it is human-made or human-affected. We're ecosystem engineers. We're extraordinary species. We're just as cool as frogs. We're even as cool as dingoes. Maybe not as cool as dogs, but we're certainly as cool as even an African elephant. And I think that's pretty good, you know, that we belong here too. We're also wild creatures.
Yes, we certainly are. And we're very powerful in how we behave in this world, and we can make it a better place for everyone, for all the creatures, great and small. Thanks, Arian. I'm going to stop our recording, but I'm happy to chat with you some more.
Bye-bye.